Okay, so in another big piece of news that happened just a couple days ago, U.S. Steel agreed to a sale to Nippon Steel for $14.1 billion. So Nippon is a Japanese firm, and Japan is one of the most industrious, one of the leading steel producers in the world. Nippon, the agreement was that Nippon will pay $55 per share in cash, which is compared to a $35 per share offer that Cleveland-Cliffs, which is an American steel producer, made in August. This would make the Japanese firm the third largest steel producer in the world, and will generally shake up the entire industry, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really interesting. Obviously, the union, the U.S. Steelworkers Union, has already come out and said that they are not in favor of this. They're hesitant to support this. Senators J.D. Vance from Ohio and Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania, J.D. Vance, Republican, John Fetterman, Democrat, have expressed concerns about this from a national security perspective, the fact that U.S. steel production is shifting towards a foreign-owned company. We definitely think this is a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, so I think we can start with the national security issue.
Yeah, let's start with national security.
I'm not concerned about the national security issue because I think Japan is one of our most trustworthy allies, if not the most trustworthy. Not to mention they're already highly prosperous on their own, so I'm not worried about them trying to extract value, excess value from the American workforce to bring back into their own country.
No, I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
I think the person who is concerned about national security, I think that we talked about how before the podcast we were talking about why is this bad from a national security perspective? I don't really see it because again, Japan is our closest ally, right? Well, if we came into some big crisis and we needed to use the Defense Production Act, where we needed to directly say which companies need to produce which things, right? Like we did with COVID. We said that General Motors and Ford, we threatened to use the Defense Production Act to make them produce ventilators instead of cars for a little while, right? So now do we have that same flexibility if this steel company is now owned by a Japanese firm? The answer is kind of hazy. The research that we've been able to done has shown that the Defense Production Act can be a little more complicated to use against foreign-owned firms. It has a lot more legal issues. It can cause diplomatic tensions with the state of Japan, given that it's such a big industry and all that.
Yeah.
But then again, you brought up a good point. It's if we need to create steel for national security, we're going to create steel for national security, whether it's Japanese owned or not.
Exactly. Quite frankly, if there's a national security issue, no amount of diplomatic tension is really going to get in the way of us co-opting a steel production facility or plant that we need to make enough steel to achieve our goals.
Yeah.
And I think if that were the case, if there were a big enough emergency, I don't imagine diplomatic relations with Japan would actually be hurt that bad because they're going to see us and understand why we needed to do it.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you this. From a national security perspective, if this was a Chinese-owned firm buying out U.S. Steel,
yeah,
I would be against it wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Because also China is China might be the leading steel producing country in the world right now.
It is, yeah.
So I don't want to give it even more leverage over that extremely important material, not only for military applications, but also important in a bunch of technology that we need for the green transition.
We talk about electric steel being a big one.
Exactly. We have right now there's a shortage of transformers, which we need for new electric generators to be able to modulate how much output they're giving at any given time. There's a shortage of transformers because there's a shortage of electric steel, and we're worried, I think for good reason, that China will kind of close the faucet of their steel production to make that issue even worse for us. We don't want to give them that kind of leverage to do it.
Right. So the national security question really comes down to which country is buying it. Because we talk a lot about decoupling from China and onshoring, but we also talk about friendshoring.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, just kind of in the realm of friendshoring or supply chain. So from a national security perspective, I'm not too scared about it. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Agreed.
J.D. Vance and John Fetterman are going to go to the Treasury Secretary and protest based off national security grounds. We'll see where that goes.
I think that would be a legitimate mistake. I don't think that's just a neutral. I think if we start if we start wanting to onshore things to such an extent that we don't want an ally like Japan to be able to own a company that's largely operated in America, then I'm scared we're getting to the point where like we want an entire American supply chain. And that's just going to raise costs for a lot of things.
But now you're not, that is correct. I agree with you, but I think it goes beyond that. And there's a political calculation to why they're doing it that I think everyone is aware of. That is the only tool that the senators have to slow it down. And they're buying time for the union to negotiate with the guys, with the companies.
Okay.
Like I think a lot of John Fetterman's and honestly JD Vance's maybe their concerns I think are less with the national security truly and more with trying to get the better deal for the workers and pulling every lever they can.
Okay.
To make that deal better.
I mean, if that's true, I'm on board. I expected the union. So should we shift to the union conversation?
So now let's shift to the union conversation.
Yeah. So the big issue that came out with this is that the United Steelworkers Union was angry when they heard this news. And they said that they had not been consulted about the sale before it went through, which is specifically part of their agreement.
Right. This is a breach of contract with U.S. Steel with the union.
Yeah. And so they said, our union intends to exercise the full measure of our agreements to ensure that whatever happens next with U.S. Steel, we protect the good, family-sustaining jobs we bargained. We also will strongly urge government regulators to carefully scrutinize this acquisition and determine if the proposed transaction serves the national security interest of the U.S. and benefits workers. Yeah. So obviously, neither of us are against the union being involved in the decision and giving it the go-ahead, because if they didn't, then I would also be concerned that Nippon had no intention on upholding the recent 4-year contract that the union signed with the company in December of last year.
Exactly. And the U.S. Steel has a lot of long-term liability contracts with the United Steelworkers Union has a lot of long-term liability contracts with U.S. Steel in regards to their pensions and retiree benefits. And they aren't sure if Nippon is going to continue those benefits as promised in their 4-year, promised in their agreements. Yeah. Now, Nippon has come out and said that they will be wholeheartedly in support of the contract and operate it in good faith and all that. But that's not something we can just wholeheartedly trust if the union wasn't at the negotiating table. Look at, Japanese car manufacturer Toyota and how they built up plants and factories in the southern parts of the United States where union laws were the weakest, specifically for the purposes of avoiding unions. So I'm not totally convinced that foreign companies will have a similar interest in abiding by a U.S., union negotiated deal.
Yeah, and it's definitely fair for them to just want to get it in writing, right? Like it's in writing with U.S. Steel, but it's not in writing with Nippon. Let's get it in writing with Nippon.
Yeah.
So I guess I didn't think about the congressional or the senators protesting in that way, because I just assumed that this deal will be held up by the courts as long as the union protests it, which maybe is too optimistic, but I think also because we have the administration we do right now, which is so friendly to unions, I would think that it'll be slowed down until there is complete union approval. And in that case, once the union does approve, I'm happy with this deal going through.
Yeah, I am on board once the union approves it. Once Nippon has made it clear that they're going to follow through with the union negotiated contract with all the long-term liabilities, retirees, and pensions, I'm honestly for it. I think it's bad that there's a larger conglomeration of the steel production industry generally. I think that's bad, but that was going to happen either way. U.S. Steel was going down. Whether it's bought by a U.S. company or a Japanese company, who cares? I mean, honestly, from an ideological perspective, they're capitalists all the same.
Yeah.
Right? A Japanese capitalist versus an American capitalist, who really cares? It's not like the company could have been owned by the workers, right?
Yeah.
So like at the end of the day, we're just trading capitalist for capitalist. There's really no difference.
Yeah, if anything, at the end of the day, I'm glad that the company sold for more to the foreign company. Like that, the difference in $55 per share versus $35, right? That's more money coming into our GDP. But also, I'm glad that a Japanese company did it, because all reporting that I've read says that the Japanese steel industry is more advanced than ours.
Oh, way more advanced.
More productive.
Yeah, and so Nippon is going to bring in more investment that U.S. Steel couldn't.
Yeah.
Nippon has more capital to invest.
Exactly.
Probably to create more jobs too.
Yeah.
Right. There's no evidence that I've seen to say that Nippon is going to cut jobs in the United States with the steel plant. They wouldn't be paying $55 a share if that's what their plan, right?
Exactly. This is probably just going to beef up the American-based supply chain, even if it is being bought by a Japanese company. They're not going to shut down steel plants. This is going to help things like our transition to the green economy, right?
And honestly, it's going to help with our local steel production, right?
Yes.
It's going to help with our local steel production. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have both been trying to increase our local steel production. This is one area where both sides have agreed. Trump, during his time in office, put a 25% tariff on all steel imports, which was already kind of an iffy policy because you know how we feel about tariffs if you watch the show. But Trump and Biden actually renegotiated these deals so that there was a quota on the amount of foreign steel that was allowed to enter the U.S. market as opposed to a generalized tariff. And the infrastructure law passed by Biden and the Inflation Reduction Act has done a lot to boost national steel demand, but it hasn't. But this is leading to a lot of subsidized steel coming in from China, and because the Chinese government subsidizes their steel like crazy, right? Specifically, so they can capture the entirety of the market and drive everyone else out of business.
Exactly.
That's exactly their plan.
Yeah. So I'm glad that this should combat that to some extent.
Yeah, it's definitely, it has its ups and downs. If the union comes out against it, then if the workers aren't getting their fair shake that they negotiated for, then that's not fair.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely not.
All right.